everyone, welcome to our community poll session. We are joined today by Celine Salcedo-La Viña, who is a research associate for the Land and Resource Rights Project at World Resources Institute Governance Centre. And in line with our monthly theme of women's rights, she is joining us today to discuss the relationship between securing land rights and women's rights. So welcome, Celine. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So if you could please tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into this field of work.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ploy, for your interest in the topic and for having me in this interview. I am from the Philippines and I'm a lawyer by training, but I'm now based in Washington, D.C., in the US, and work at an organization called the World Resources Institute, or WRI, where I am an associate, as Ploy said, and land tenure and gender specialist. My research is focused on collective land rights, gender, and women's land rights, and as well environmental issues at WRI's Governance Center. So I would say this is a second career for me. Back home in the Philippines, I did start with human rights work as a college student, and after graduation, our country was under a dictatorship back then. Um, Fast forward, we have what is called a people power revolution, and we toppled the dictator. I went to law school and did, regular legal work, shifted to like regular law practice after that. Fast forward again many years into the future, this is me going back to my human rights roots, um, so to speak, but with an expanded focus on collective land rights, indigenous and customary rights, gender and climate, women's land rights, and environmental issues. So back to you, Ray.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. And really interesting to see that you've had different careers as such, and in a circular way you come back around to human rights, which is what we love to hear at Human Rights Pulse. So that's great. So what are land rights and how can this further women's rights?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, land rights are really a set of rights to a specific piece of land. And these rights are often referred to as the bundle of land rights, as in sticks in a bundle, because each piece of right or stick can be separated from the others, or in the sense that they can be held by different people. So these sticks or set of rights consist of first the right of access or the right to be on the land, to walk across it. A second right would be the right of withdrawal or the right to take something from the land, such as firewood, water, wild plants, fodder, some wildlife, unless it's prohibited by law, and similar things you find in land. Third is the right of management or the right to regulate the use or make improvements such as plant crops, let it lay fallow, clear bush, or improve the soil, things of that sort. Fourth is the right of exclusion or the right to prevent others from entering and using the land. And fifth is the right of transfer, the right to sell, rent, lease, gift, bequeath, or alienate the land. So a person who holds all five rights or sticks is the owner of the land. It's possible that someone holds different sticks in the bundle. For example, a lessee can hold the right of access, withdrawal, and management, but not the right of exclusion and transfer. So that is land rights. Now, for the second part of your question, land rights can further women's rights in many ways. In the first place, land is an asset. It's a productive resource, right? It can be put to productive use. For example, in rural communities, when a woman owns or controls land, she can cultivate that land and use the harvest to feed her family, sell the extra harvest to earn independent income, which she can then use to invest, for example, in her children's education and health. She can also use the land as collateral for credit or loans, to buy more land, to buy farm implements, or even to repair her house. So, land rights is a foundation for women's economic empowerment. It allows women to live better lives. But it's not just economic benefits. Land rights can increase a woman's bargaining power within the household. It allows her to have greater standing in the community because she's a landowner. She will then have leverage to speak up at village meetings. It also enhances her ability to negotiate because she has collateral, um, which is valuable. Studies also show that land rights reduce a woman's risk of suffering domestic or marital violence. And land ownership can provide a woman fallback in case of divorce or death of the spouse. It allows her to build intergenerational wealth by passing land to her children. So, those are some of the many ways where women can benefit from land rights.
Thanks, Celine. That's so interesting, because obviously we are surrounded by land. Yeah,
Right.
we think of it as, well, land to build a house or land to grow crops, but actually land could be used so much more, in terms of empowering women and, yeah, like foster the cycle of the next generation being successful. And I guess, to me, when I was reading up about it, I found that it was just a bit underrated, I suppose, as a resource or as a tool to help further women's rights. So that's really interesting, and a really good snapshot and analogy in terms of the sticks of different types of rights. I think that was really interesting as well.
Well, I'm glad you found it interesting.
And what was the history of women's land rights? For example, why are we not using that more to further women's rights?
Mhm, mhm. So, I'll preface that by saying that different countries and even different places within countries may have different tenure systems. Now, tenure systems are the set of rules by which land is owned by an individual, owned or held, I should say, by an individual or a group. So those tenure system or the set of rules can be defined by the state through legislation, or customary authorities through customary rules or practices, or in some instances, religious law, for example, the Sharia. So the history of women's land rights will really vary from place to place. Um, but I'll hone in on collectively held lands, or indigenous and customary lands, because that's the focus of my research. And I am gonna give a couple of examples, and if I may, do a shameless plug in our recently released report on equal ground, promising practices for realizing women's rights in collectively held lands. We studied 5 communities from 5 countries, and in each place, women acquired land in different ways. There may be some commonalities or common aspects, but the specific trajectory is different for each community. So, a couple of examples. Number one, in Cameroon. Cameroon does typify customary communities in many respects. Of course, it varies contextually in other places. But in Cameroon, a woman acquires access to land through her husband, father, or other male relative. When she gets married, she moves to her husband's village and she's given a piece of land by her husband or his family, which she then cultivates to produce food for the household. So if you apply the bundle of land rights framework, she has the right of access and withdrawal and may co-share the right to manage and exclude with her husband, but certainly she won't have the right to transfer. So it's a limited set of rights. But with the introduction of the forestry law, which created community forests in Cameroon, or forest land that can be formally registered in the name of the community, this allowed women to gain rights in their own capacity. Registration as a community forest is advantageous for communities, so they would go for it because number one, it gives them legal recognition and thus protects them from outside claims. So one of the requirements under forestry regulations is that all segments of the community must be included in the Community Forestry Association, which is the body that will hold title to the registered community forest. So this became the entry point for women to acquire land in their own capacity. As members of the Community Forest Association, they are considered legitimate co-owners and stakeholders in the land, whereas previously they only had derivative rights and incomplete rights. So that's one way of showing the history of women's land rights. Another example would be Indonesia, the other community we studied in our research. So, the community we went to is a matriarchal community, which means that they practice a matrilineal inheritance systems, or land is passed down along the female line from mother to daughter. And they also practice what is called matrilocal residency, which means that it is the man who moves to the woman's village upon marriage. So each daughter is given a piece of land, ancestral land in her name, and it is this land which the spouses together cultivate um, and decide on how to spend the income. Although it is the wife who manages the family budget, so she has that leverage based on ownership. So it's a completely different scenario from the Cameroon, where women eventually earned rights. Here, women have rights from the beginning. Um, it is a less common scenario, though. The Cameroon example is more typical in customary communities around the world. And if I may add a quick third example, let's say the Mexico case study that we did. So in Mexico, women's land rights are connected to agrarian reform, under which land that was historically owned by oligarchs or large landowners were redistributed to peasants and rural communities after, of course, a revolution, right? It has to happen before any redistribution can occur. So it was redistributed in the form of what is called ejidos or comunidades, which are two types of collective land ownership called social property under the Mexican Constitution. So in the beginning, only the male heads of households were registered as co-owners of ejidos and comunidades. But eventually, the state revised it to allow women who are also heads of household, so they must be providers, to be able to register, to apply as co-owners. But that, again, through the years, I think it's in the 1970s where the law finally opened it up to any member of the community, male or female, subject, of course, to an application, fulfillment of requirements, and such as residency, and fulfillment of obligations as member. So those are three examples of historically how women acquired rights.
Thanks, Celine. It's really nice snapshot, and I love that you can compare the, how the system is in sort of three different examples. It's very practical. I would like to just let everyone know that I will link your report that you wrote after the session somewhere or on the website.
All right, thank you.
And it's a very good read, so
Oh, appreciate it. Thanks.
And yeah, so now that we know what land rights are, its history, what more can be done, and why are women not landowners, or more women aren't landowners?
Um, you know, I will, if you will allow me to start with the big picture, right? Because we're talking about collectively held lands. Um, there are about 2.5 to 3 billion people around the world who rely on land for their livelihoods, their survival, and their well being. So, for these people in indigenous and customary communities, land lies at the heart of their political, their economic, and social life. It is the primary source of food, income, and employment for them. It is the basis of security, status, social identity, and political relations. And the estimate is that indigenous and customary communities occupy 50% of the world's land. So that gives context and why we should do more to ensure that community and women have land rights. So they will benefit from legal recognition of their rights. If I may also add that recognizing and respecting indigenous and customary land rights yield benefits. For example, study shows that forests managed by indigenous peoples and other local communities have lower deforestation rates compared to similar lands managed by others, for example, some protected areas. Um, and it's even better when indigenous territories have legally recognized rights, um, because the rates of deforestation are significantly lower than indigenous lands that have weak or unrecognized rights. And of course, lower rates of deforestation leads to other benefits such as higher rates of carbon storage and better biodiversity protection. And so, given that context, the question is, why then are women not landowners? Um, and again, let me add some statistics. So, in many rural communities, or should I say, 70% of smallholder farmers in the developing world are women, from which 80% of the food is grown in small farms. Yet only 14% of agricultural landowners are women. So you can see the disparity. Another study that compared 80 community based tenure regimes, mostly forest communities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, showed that less than a third explicitly extended membership rights to women. So the statistics are a bit grim. So let's go to the reasons why women are not landowners. First and foremost, because historically, as I explained in the Cameroon example, women's access to land are based on or is based on status within the family and involves the right of use, not ownership. Um, in Asia, I understand one of the most prevalent barriers for women to own land is inheritance laws, which favor the male inheritance or sons over daughters. And if a woman, happens to inherit property, the expectation is that it will be managed by the husband. In some places, women may formally hold rights, but they only do so during their lifetime. They cannot pass it on. Upon death, it reverts back to the male line, maybe her husband or maybe her uncle or brother, depending on how she acquired the land. It's a similar situation in Africa where custom excludes women from land rights. It's normally held in the male line and practicing a patrilineal inheritance system. In other places, for example, in Latin America, the discrimination results from limited status under the law. Women may reach majority age of 21, but the law still requires that they be represented by their husbands in all legal capacities. So if they want to purchase land or deal in land, the husband has to be a co-signatory. I know for a fact that in the Philippines, uh, women cannot acquire loans unless their husbands are co-signatories. So those kinds of limitations. And added to this, for example, um, land titling initiatives or those projects where communities are provided or given formal titles to lands that they're occupying. In most instances, at least in the beginning, these initiatives applied the head of household concept. And of course, de facto, it is the husband who's considered the head of household. So any title goes to the husband's name alone. Although recently there have been some improvements and some attention given to women's rights, so there's more, you can see more of joint titling interventions nowadays. Literacy is also a big barrier. In the vast majority of rural communities, women have lower literacy rates than men. So they are simply unaware of their rights. And even if they are, they don't know how to claim them. So that's why in our report we emphasize that legal reforms must be complemented with interventions on the ground that allow women to claim and exercise rights. And of course, an example with this would be, rights awareness campaigns and NGOs and CBOs actively helping women acquire titles to their lands. So, did I answer the question? I might have gone on a little too long.
No, yeah, you did. I think you gave a few different reasons as to why women or more women aren't landowners. And yeah, it's sorry, I'm just taking it in. It's
Okay, yeah.
very interesting. I think activism work or human rights work often, you know, general public think it's the person advocating for it at the forefront in the course or something, but actually if you take a more of a holistic approach in terms of, there's researchers, policy advisors, there's NGOs working on the ground to empower and explain that these women have rights, then and then a bit of campaign work so that the wider community understands it, then together we're more likely to sort of make that change and make those rights more accessible to women. Um, so another question I had is, I know your work focuses primarily on rural communities,
Mhm.
but can land rights be used to further women's rights in sort of the global north or in, bigger cities, or is it primarily sort of rural communities?
Yeah, so you're right. I did focus on rural communities, but I do know that land rights is an issue in many urban communities because the rights of informal settlements or big slum areas. Um, so I there is this an economist previous. I don't know if you're familiar with Hernando de Soto, who's an economist who said that um, providing these communities with rights to the small plots that they occupy allow them to economically make economic use of it and conduct economic activities, use that land as collateral, and do small businesses. So it creates economic activity. So even if it's not full title, because after all, it's an informal settlement, so it might be owned by the state, might be public land, or someone who left the land idle. But giving them some form of title or paper uh, will allow for activities that improve not only the lives of those people but create activity across the community. So that's one way. I would say though that in the global north, where people are more educated and land is privatized, right? It's not community owned. It's easier. The question, of course, is the financial capability to own land, and another, I guess, issue would be scarcity. If there is enough land for to buy, and um, factors including location will come into play. But land is an asset. It's a productive asset. So anywhere global north or global south, it's something that would be good to hold on to. It would be good to acquire because it increases value over time.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Celine. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think obviously with the case studies that you've written about in the report, we can see how much value that adds for women's rights. But also I think from a global perspective, it's really interesting to recognize the importance, like you say, that land is an asset and how wherever you are, you
Right.
know, we should be talking about it. We should be understanding more about how it can help vulnerable people or just the community and society as a whole.
Right.
So thank you for that. And one last thing, very topical. How has COVID-19 affected women's access to land rights?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's very timely, right? I'm glad that there's hope in the air with the vaccine, but that was a full year. And so it has impacted women in many ways. At one level, they are affected as part of their communities, right? In terms of health inequalities, most Indigenous and Customary communities are not reached by health services. So even if they are, most of them can't afford to access or secure health services or go to hospitals. So that's one impact. Another impact is lockdowns left a gap in law enforcement in many far-flung communities, resulting in an uptick of illegal forest activities. For example, an increase in logging and mining in the Amazon, which led to greater deforestation and forest fires during the COVID period. Some governments, for example, the Brazilian government, also eased environmental restrictions to try to spur the economy, which is, of course, detrimental to communities and the women in those communities. And third, which they suffer along with their community, is the increase in violence, the recorded increase in violence against land and environmental defenders for trying to, stop those illegal incursions in their lands. And they are unable to go into hiding because of travel bans. So that's at one level. Now, for women in particular, COVID 19 has affected the livelihoods of many women farmers. As we said before, 70% of smallholder farmers in the developing world is women. So, as markets closed and cross border trade declined, women suffered a double whammy. They are unable to sell their produce or were forced to sell it at very low prices, and at the same time the markets are not open, so they can not get access to seeds, tools, and other inputs that they need for the next planting season. So there's a lot of food insecurity that happened. And it's a good thing that many governments responded with social assistance, social protection, some cash transfers. But that is a problem for women who are seasonal agricultural laborers. They are unlikely to get those benefits, unemployment and social assistance benefits, because they're not in the system. They're seasonal laborers. And the same goes for women farmers. They're left out, or they may be left out of agricultural stimulus packages unless it's done correctly, because they're not the landowners. So those who are to access land through their male relatives will not get those transfers that are given to agricultural landowners. And another that I may add finally is that as we all well know, the lockdowns increase unpaid domestic and care work for women universally. And this is in normal times, the studies show that women already do 3 times as much as men do in terms of domestic and care work. And for rural women, this is really hard because they are charged with caregiving, food preparation, planting, maintaining the house, and also primarily responsible for nursing back to health family members who fall ill. There are traditional communities where, by custom, women in the household are the ones who eat last, or they might, in their own, by their own decision, let the rest of the family eat you know before they do so, partake of food themselves. And this, it's very tragic because at a time when they are carrying more burdens, their immunity and their health are compromised. So those are three or some of the main things that COVID aggravated women and their relationship to land.
Wow, thanks. I mean,
Sorry for that sad note, but
no, it's a very real situation, and this is exactly what we want to do with this platform, is to share these issues, which as often isn't touched on in the news. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I hope that this will be a good starting point for many people to understand what land rights are and what advantages there are to further women's rights, both in rural communities and everywhere. I hope that things get better for everyone with the vaccine um,
Yeah.
and all of that. And yeah, lots and lots to think about. Um, do you have any last thoughts, Celine, you want to share?
Yeah, just very quickly. I agree. Women are really disproportionately burdened by COVID-19, and that they have fewer and lesser rights to land than men. So, just a call to the development community to pay more attention to women's land rights. And, as we said in our report, all projects or interventions must be done at two levels: the structural level, looking at the laws, the rules, and also at the operational level, or the actions on the ground to help women realize their rights. So they must be complementary and interlinked. Um, Laws are important. Explicit mandates for women's inclusion are important to include in the laws. And secondly, actions like rights awareness, gender sensitization, um, including gender analysis in any before undertaking any intervention, and even practical interventions such as improve cook stoves, piped water, electricity, access to digital or mobile services allow women to, you know, reduce the time poverty and their domestic burdens and allow them to pursue other things. So, and I guess as a final, I think it's important to engage men from the outset in any intervention or project. It's important to sensitize them in culturally appropriate ways of the benefits of recognizing women's knowledge, experience, and contributions. So let me end there. Thank you for this opportunity, Ploy.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Celine, for joining us. I've certainly learnt a lot. Definitely a good starting point to read up further on this topic, and how we can drum up more conversations about it and spread the knowledge, and hopefully be able to realize some practical steps to sort of further women's rights.
Mhm.
Thanks so much for your time, Celine, and yeah, take care, and I'll be in touch shortly.
Thank you, Ploy. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.